Town of Los Gatos Planning Commission meeting of Wednesday, August 14, 2019 is now called to order. Please take a moment to silence your devices. Ms. Arnowitz, would you please call the roll?
Yes, Commissioner Badami.
Here.
Commissioner Birch. Here. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Here.
Commissioner Tavana.
Here.
Commissioner Janoff.
Here.
And Chair Hudas.
Here.
And Vice Chair Hansen is absent.
Okay, I'd like everyone to stand and join Commissioner Birch in the Pledge of Allegiance. As the Planning Commission conducts the meeting this evening on behalf of the Town Council and the residents of Los Gatos, we encourage active participation, which is essential for democracy and critical to the work of the Planning Commission. We have two opportunities for participation, comments that are submitted in writing and also verbal comments. And the verbal comments can be about an item that is not on the agenda or about a specific agenda item. I don't see anyone wishing to address. I have no speaker cards, so we can move on to the consent calendar. We have one consent item to be acted on in a single motion, and of course that can get pulled if necessary, or anyone either on the commission or the public would like to have it pulled. The one item is approval of the minutes, July 10, 2019. Do we have a motion on the consent calendar? Commissioner Badami?
I move to approve the consent item, which is the minutes of July 10th, 2019.
Okay, do we have a second? Commissioner O'Donnell, second. We'll now call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Passes unanimously. So we now move to public hearings portion of our agenda, and we'll consider item number 2, which is a town-wide application. The applicant is the town of Los Gatos, and it's considering modifications to chapter, this is all of the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines, and so it's modifications to chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10. So I understand, Ms. Schutman, that you'll be giving the staff report tonight.
Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. The item in front of you is consideration of modifications to chapters 3 through 6 and 8 through 10 of the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines as recommended by the Town Council Policy Committee and forwarded to you for your recommendation to the Council. The recommendation from the Policy Committee proposes to modify the deciding body for single-story additions over 800 square feet or greater than 20% of the existing floor area from the Development Review Committee to the Community Development Director. In addition, to modify the deciding body for homes over 5,000 square feet that do not exceed the maximum allowable floor area and are not visible from the Planning Commission to the Development Review Committee. Remove the requirement that subsequent architecture and site applications may not be applied for the same property for a period of 3 years following the issuance of an occupancy permit, and to modify language regarding accessory dwelling units, viewing areas, below grade square footage, fences, and entry gates to be consistent with previous amendments to the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines and amendments to the zoning ordinance. This concludes staff's presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Are there questions? Okay. I had a question. So this is about process. My understanding is that by moving the approval from the DRC to the from the Planning Commission to the DRC, the approval body is changing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So in terms of streamlining, are any steps being taken out of the process?
No, so no steps are being taken out of the process. The same departments, which include building, planning, fire, and engineering, are all still reviewing the application, and it's still being publicly noticed.
Okay. So in the interest of understanding the benefits of streamlining, how often have we had these appeals of this type of a hillside development in the last 5 years or so?
So are you asking if we had any appeals or how many applications we've processed?
Well, I guess it's applications.
We've processed.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were able to pull data from the last 3 years, and we were able to determine that 13 new hillside homes have been applied for. 7 have been greater than 5,000 square feet. 5 of those did go to the Planning Commission and were approved at greater than 5,000 square feet. And 6 applications were approved by the Development Review Committee because they were less than 5,000 square feet.
Okay. So, okay. The other question I had was about, on page 30, the criteria for the Planning Commission approving a residential project greater than the maximum that's allowed. So basically it states that the Town Council or Planning Commission may approve a project greater than the maximum when all of the following criteria apply. And I'm focusing in on number, number 8, which says a significant below-grade square footage element is included in the design unless it conflicts with other standards. So I'm a little bit confused about this one and what this achieves. So could you explain number 8, and can you explain what's achieved by it?
I'll take a stab at that, and then if the director wants to join in, he can. But these would be, the one issue would be how that is written and whether you wanted to change just the wordsmithing of it a little bit. I guess the other would be whether that would be required in order to approve that larger amount, or whether that would be something that would be considered in that, in approving the larger amount of square footage.
Well, I was just trying to understand the intention of it, because the way it's worded, it appears that it would encourage or compel people to add below-grade square footage, when in fact, I think from some of the hearings I've been in, the intention is to do a trade-off where additional square footage is put underground rather than outside. And I'm wondering if the way this is worded, it actually doesn't achieve that, but encourages additional square footage to be put below grade.
Yeah, and I think that we can take that recommendation and look at that language before taking this on to council, if that's what the commission would like.
And through the chair, you know, it's difficult to know in, what was it, 2004, I think, when these were originally adopted, what the intent was. In looking at it, it does seem a little bit counterintuitive in that you're asking to exceed the FAR. We want you to put a whole bunch of square footage underground, which gives you more square footage, and then we want you to increase it above from a visible mass perspective. The one thing that could come into play is you may have an existing house that has an existing cellar, and you want to add 100 square feet, 500 square feet. So you already have that cellar element, and so then you're looking to request that. The opposite would be, you know, if someone came in and they had no cellar but they wanted to exceed the FAR, that's where we would be looking to try to get them to put that underground, which theoretically then would hopefully bring them down below the square footage. But if you have any specific language or ideas on how that should be worded, the other option obviously is that that could be removed if that's of interest from the commission.
Okay. Well, when we get to deliberating, I'll think about maybe some different language, because I don't know that it's accomplishing what the intention is as it's worded. Just, it strikes me the wording may not achieve that. So, okay. Are there any questions further of staff? Okay. Then I will close the I'll close the applicant's portion, and I have no cards from the public, so the public portion of the hearing is closed as well, and we'll move into discussion, deliberations, and perhaps a motion. Any comments from fellow commissioners on this? Commissioner Badami.
I would agree with the chair's recommendation. I would go along with some type of change to what he's suggesting. I wouldn't know what that might be, but it seems to me it is counterintuitive there.
So the thought that I had was that if we're really trying to encourage a trade-off so that additional square footage is put underground, then maybe we just state that so that it's, you know, it's encouraged to put any square footage that would be beyond the FAR to be located underground if possible. It just seems a little more straightforward. Commissioner O'Donnell.
That's not what it says, though. It's not even, that's not even close, I think, to what it says. So if you want to add some new concept, I guess that would be fine. But I think your original comment that this really doesn't make a lot of sense is true. If I understand the rejoinder was, yeah, it happened a long time ago, and we're just trying to clean it up a little bit. But if you don't like it, you can take it out. I don't know what they're, you know, it's never been our attitude that if you put a basement in, that's great, because now you can put more above. I remember many discussions where we said, you've got this huge basement, but you haven't reduced the size of the house at all, and that was the original intent. So this language, I think, is better gone than there, and your comment may be a good comment, but I don't think it has anything to do with number 8.
Well, actually, I didn't finish my thought, but my thought would be that would be removed. The language that's in there would be removed, and the language that I suggested would be added to encourage people, if they do need to go beyond the FAR, to put it underground.
So you would not, it would be, I mean, you would.
I wouldn't make it a requirement, as it is today, one of the 8 that has to be met.
But there's no inhibition at the moment preventing them from putting in a bigger basement. So what, the thought I get here is 2 things are happening. 1, we're talking about the basement or cellar area, and 2, we're talking about the above ground area. Your comment, if I understand it correctly, deals only with the underground comment. In other words, you don't get any bonus points for putting in a bigger basement, which I agree with you on. Although originally the concept was, we could say to people, why are you building such a big house when you've got a 2,000 square foot subterranean portion of the house? And then we'd argue about that. But what you're putting in, or suggesting we put in, I'm just not sure why we need that.
Yeah, so,
Could we just get a reread? Because I'm not sure I heard what.
okay, so what I'm saying is that I think that number 8 may encourage development that we don't want.
Right.
So my suggestion, as Commissioner O'Donnell said, would be to strike number 8. Additionally, my thought was that since the concept isn't addressed elsewhere, that if an applicant requires more than the allowable floor area ratio, to consider putting it below grade instead of asking for an exception to the.
And I guess all I'm saying is, wouldn't that, we would hope that would occur to somebody, because if you stand pat on what you're going to grant above ground, and they have an architect or somebody that knows what's going on, they would tell them you can have a bigger basement.
Right. So basically, you're saying it's not necessary to make that a statement.
That's what I think,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Janoff?
Yeah, I think if what we're, I agree that it could be struck from the list of, because you don't really want to encourage that as a requirement for approval. So, but I do think it makes sense to cover it elsewhere. What I was thinking might be, because what we're talking about is offsetting above ground square footage by burying it, not adding to. So I would just simply say a significant below grade square footage element is included in the design to offset above ground square footage. And put that as a separate statement somewhere. I'm not sure where it would be appropriate, but make it a separate objective for hillside structures.
And you're suggesting that it be removed as one of the criteria for allowing the commission to decide whether to go over the FAR?
Yes.
And then through the chair.
Yes.
So I guess the only thing that comes to mind for that is if someone does decide to put that square footage underground, they no longer will be exceeding the FAR. So we can look at where that language should go to kind of encourage that rather than going through this process of exceeding the FAR.
And also through the chair, there is some language under bulk and mass that talks about excavate or use below grade rooms to reduce effective bulk. So it looks like there are some recommendations there.
What page is that?
That is on page 38 of the design guidelines, but you don't.
And which one is that? Oh, that's K? Yeah. Is that sufficient, do you think, Commissioner Janoff?
I would say not, because it doesn't specifically address square footage, and so this could be the place where that language is inserted. But I would say, as it reads now, we're still missing that concept of the offset, go below to get the square footage. Yeah.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
So what we're saying is, oh, you can't do it that way, but you could do it this way. I mean, I just don't know why. If you read it, you know that's the case. Do we have to say, oh, come look at this, you can make a bigger house, here's how you do it? Why do we want to do that?
Commissioner Janoff.
I'm relatively new on the Planning Commission, but I have yet to see an application where we've seen a hillside design that doesn't try to exceed in every possible square or otherwise corner of the structure to maximize well beyond what is proposed. So I think it's reasonable if the intent of the guideline or the intent of the Planning Commission or the town at this time is to try to minimize the above ground square footage, it's reasonable to include language that says that.
Well, I don't think your proposal says that, but I don't see any harm in it. To me, we're telling people what the limits are, and if we did that, what we've done each time is somebody comes in with a big basement, and they still want to get, typically, every square foot they can possibly get, and then somebody gets up and says, of us, gee whiz, the idea of the basement was to take away from the bulk and mass. Nobody pays any attention to that, and typically we approve it. Now, adding this little thought you have is fine. I have nothing wrong with it, but I'm not exactly sure why we want to do that, because we haven't, in my recollection, we've said that every time. You've got a big basement, you don't need that in the house. I can't tell you statistically how many we've approved, but I think a lot. So if you put it in, we're saying, gee whiz, would you please think again about the basement? And I'm just saying that's nice, but anybody that's appeared before us or read our rules kind of knows that. But if you want to highlight it, I don't have anything wrong with it. You can highlight it.
Okay, so we're at a point where maybe we should either entertain a motion with specific language or a motion to drop number 8. Wonder if people have thoughts about whether we should continue to try to work the language now. Commissioner O'Donnell?
I think we could divide that into two parts. I think probably we're all in agreement that 8 should just be deleted, because the discussion now is not about that sequence, but to put it someplace else. So I'd like to make a motion just on that one point, and that motion would be, we strike the proposed section or paragraph 8, and then simply change the numbering. 9, of course, would become 8. So that's the motion.
Okay, do we have a second? Commissioner Badami?
Second?
Okay, discussion? Okay, all in favor? Okay, passes unanimously, 6-0. So the second thing is there specific, I didn't come prepared with specific language, as you can see. And I don't know whether anyone else would like to take a try at specific language, talking about the trade-off or the trade-off. Okay. I think we may have other opportunities to deal with this in the future, so I think we can move to further discussion of this item. Are there other points that people would like to bring up? Commissioner Badami?
I would just like to say that we're just forwarding a recommendation to town council, so it could be that along the way, staff or council also has an opportunity to refine some wording on this particular issue.
Okay. So the other point that I wanted to raise as part of the recommendation is my concern about removing the Planning Commission review of applications. As I asked the question earlier, I don't think it achieves an objective of streamlining, because there's still a hearing, there's still a notice. It's just the hearing shifts from Planning Commission to DRC. And there are compelling reasons to have certain items heard by a Planning Commission as compared to staff. And in my mind, one of the primary objectives that's achieved when you bring it to a hearing such as a Planning Commission is visibility and transparency. It isn't about the power of the Planning Commission, it's about the visibility that residents have to what's going on. And yes, they can attend a DRC meeting. DRC meeting is typically at 10 o'clock on a weekday. And given the number that we've heard of applications that met the criteria of going to Planning Commission, I believe it was 13 or so, that to me is limiting visibility to these things, and frankly limiting some of the debate and discussion that goes on. It doesn't achieve streamlining really, because it's still the same step. It's a hearing that's noticed. It's a hearing before the Planning Commission that is being moved to a hearing before the DRC. Commissioner O'Donnell.
I think that same comment can be made about every document we're going to look at tonight. It's clear that somebody would like to remove the Planning Commission from as much as possible, with the theory being it'll be faster if those guys aren't involved. That may be true, but your comment, I think, to a Planning Commissioner is persuasive. I like the concept that the public can participate, and I do think it's very difficult to show up at 10 or 10:30 in the morning, and when I read the minutes of what goes on at 10 or 10:30 in the morning, almost nobody ever says anything, and nobody ever shows up, except the people who are directly involved. So to me, it's a fundamental issue. We serve at the pleasure of the council, and the council gets to draft the rules. And if the council says, we'd like you guys to do very little, they can say that. But this is sort of like death by 1,000 cuts. And this whole thing tonight is about how can we get the Planning Commission out. We're going to really speed it up, because we're going to have, in many cases, one person make the decision, and no hearing is required, but it can be appealed. And it doesn't bother me that much. Maybe that's because I'm almost finished here, but that's the whole point of the night. And as I said, I happen to believe the planning commission allows people to get their comments in. It could be slower, but it isn't slower in the one instance you're talking about. But some of these we'll look at, it doesn't go to a committee. In fact, it takes away from that committee too and gives to Joel, is what it really does. I'm sure he's not looking for that, but he'll be stuck with it. And I don't know how that helps the public. The theory being that somehow things are so slow around here that they have to be speeded up. And I'm sure the staff can tell me why things are so slow around here. I haven't observed that, but I'm sure there must be a lot of war stories. And if those war stories suggest if only the planning commission wasn't involved, we wouldn't have these problems. I've never heard that argument, but it sure would be nice if we did hear that argument, because that's what this is all about.
I maybe wanted to just add one other point. Having, now been involved in the Planning Commission for almost 4 years, and having been involved in other town committees and commissions, I realize that we're at a point in time of a heritage and legacy of people caring about this town. And yes, things can get changed by the current council. A policy committee of 2 people, yes, can have a big impact. But there are many people over years who put a great deal of effort and thought into our hillside design guidelines and standards. And the public remembers that, and the public shows up for these hearings often because they care about what is going on the hillsides. And so I am reluctant to make a change easily to the process that has served the town well. I think the town is really exemplary in the way we treat the hillsides. We treat things differently than many other towns, having looked at many ordinances where they don't distinguish. We do, and there's been a lot of care and thought put into the process. So for that reason, again, I would be reluctant to make a change to a process that served the town well and doesn't seem to really add very much to streamlining.
Pardon me, just to aid in your discussion of this, there are some differences too in the architecture and site application that's either reviewed by the Planning Commission or the Development Review Committee, and that's the cost of the application and the length of time. So applications that are reviewed by the Development Review Committee are typically approximately $3,700 less than being reviewed by the Planning Commission, and can take about 2 months less time to process when they're reviewed by the Development Review Committee.
Okay, thank you. And just as a follow-up, what is 3,700 less? What is the total that we're talking about?
The total for an architecture and site application to be reviewed by our Development Review Committee is $10,071.03.
Okay.
And by the Planning Commission, it's $13,713.99.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Commissioner Badami.
Okay, so devil's advocate on the flip side here. If the town likes revenue, why do we want to reduce our revenue by reducing these associated costs? Just throwing that out there.
Okay. I'm going to go to Commissioner Janoff.
Just a clarification from staff, please. This is a limited, as I read the modification, it's a fairly narrow, it's over 5,000 square feet, but still within the maximum allowable floor area, and it's not visible. When you mentioned that there were 13 applications that came before the Planning Commission, did they meet that criteria, or were they just hillsides over 5,000 square feet? I'm curious about, I'm curious whether they were, I mean, I can't think of one that wasn't visible. So I'm just not sure what that number was.
So the 13,000, this was just a snapshot in time. Sorry, the 13 applications. That's all of the ANSs for, or architecture and site applications for a new hillside home. So that's just to say within these 3 years, 13 of those types of applications came in. Not all of those were over 5,000 square feet. 7 of them, of the 13, were actually over 5,000 square feet. And then in that same period of time, we looked at how many applications for new homes in the hillside over 5,000 that the Planning Commission saw. and that was 5. And then how many under did DRC see, and that was 6. So relatively, roughly half as they come in are either over or below 5,000 square feet. Is
But
the
just to-
30,000 foot level.
Okay, and just to further clarify, the planning commission would still see applications that are over 5,000 square feet that are visible.
Yes, if it was determined to be a visible home, the way the guidelines define it, it would be reviewed by the planning commission.
And forgive me, there's no change to that. And there's a change from viewing platform to viewing area in the associated papers that we have, but no change to the notion that there's an area from which you can view these properties.
Yes, no change to that.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Okay, so what I've heard now is one way it will be more efficient will be it will save the applicant roughly $3,000. And the other way is it takes 2 months longer, sort of minimum, it takes 2 months longer. So the applicant will benefit by the amount of money and the time. And I take it, so I can see how that would be, I accept that as the case. I guess the only issue is when you use those objective standards on a fairly subjective thing, which is the approval of architectural site and that kind of thing, it isn't a calculation of numbers that you add up and there it is. It's when you look at it and you listen to the public and you decide whether that's what you really want. So I wouldn't argue with the fact that you'll save $3,000 on some of these applications, and it will be shorter. I guess the real question is, are the distinguishing factors where you're going to save that enough to make sure that the public gets enough input? Because as I said before, maybe you have different experience with the 10, I think it's 10:30 in the morning, it might be 10. Whenever I read the minutes, there's almost nobody there. And it takes about 4 minutes before a unanimous motion is made, and it's approved. So that's fine, that's very efficient. But if you weigh that against the consideration by 7 people who have different jobs to do, is there a trade-off? Because that's what we're dealing with. And personally, when I went through all these things, the overarching message I got was the best way to solve this stuff is to have fewer people involved, and that kind of makes sense, because they said if we don't have the planning commission involved, that ought to speed things up, save money. And then your other committee, if we get rid of those guys, we have it all decided by Joel, that's going to save time and save money. That's where we kind of are, and if that's the case, we can have a fairly short night.
Well, we are just considering the first item.
I know, but it's
so-
all- it's
and they
all
are.
the same.
Well, I do see personally. I do see some differences, and I, in fact, don't have issues with some of the other ones. But this one, in particular, came to my attention, and it was just me recalling the hearings that we've had, the input from the neighbors and from the town, and often we have people who come and speak about these who are not noticed because the way the hillsides are a treasure of the whole town. And so people look at the planning commission agenda and they say, I think I need to come and talk about this one. And I think we've had quite a bit of that. Now, they could do that at the DRC, they could, but the hearing is a different kind of a hearing. And I am reluctant to make that change given the investment that the town has in the hillsides and the process that's, I think, served us well. So I'm prepared to make a motion on this unless folks have other points.
Find out what your comment about, it's clear that all we're doing is making a recommendation, right? So your comment would go to whether or not we recommend that approval.
Yes,
Okay, that's fine.
Commissioner Janoff. Yep.
I would just ask that the motion, in making the motion, I know that the concerns that the planning commission has voiced will be heard by the town council, but it's, I think, useful to summarize the salient concerns in the motion.
Okay, so I'll try, and then if someone would like to second and help me out, I'd appreciate that as well. So I move that we forward a recommendation to approve the changes in in item number 2 to the modifications to chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10 as written, with 2 exceptions. One is to strike on page 30, item 8, and the second change is to leave in place the current language about the approval process for hillside development applications. So that's the heart of the motion, and I would add to that that I have difficulty in finding compelling evidence that this would make very much of a streamlining difference, but that it would in fact result in a loss of visibility and transparency on hillside developments. So that's where I'm going to stop. Would anyone like to comment or second? Okay, Commissioner O'Donnell seconds. Any further comments, Commissioner Badami?
I'm in agreement, so I will be supporting the motion.
Okay. Any other comments?
Through the chair,
Yes. Yes.
you stated that the changes that were proposed in chapter 9 related to Development Review Committee. There's more than just the 5,000 square foot. Did you intend to mean all of the changes you don't agree with, or just the homes
What
over
page
5,000?
are you talking about?
Page 66 and 67 have a number of changes to deciding bodies. So the one that you've been talking about is the homes over 5,000 square feet going to the Planning Commission, but there are a number of other changes moving from DRC to building permit, for instance, which is the Director of Community Development. So I wanted to
Correct.
make sure we have the distinction of, are you talking about all of those or just specifically the 5,000 square foot homes?
Just specifically the 5,000 square foot home.
Thank you.
Commissioner Tavana.
I was just going to say, I think you summed it up very nicely, and I'll be supporting the motion.
Okay, I'll call the question. All in favor? Okay, opposed? Passes unanimously, 6-0. Okay, we now, there's no appeal because this is a recommendation, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Let me move to item number 3, which is Town Code Amendment Application A19004, again, town-wide, and this is amendments to Chapter 29 regarding parking lot improvement regulations. Ms. Schupman.
Good evening. The item in front of you is consideration of an amendment to Chapter 29 of the zoning code regarding parking lot improvement regulations as recommended by the Town Council Policy Committee and forwarded to you for your recommendation to the Council. The recommendation from the Policy Committee proposes to modify the deciding body for building permits for parking lot improvements, such as restriping or reconfigurations, from the Development Review Committee to the Director of Community Development. This concludes staff's presentation, and we are happy to answer any questions.
Question I had was, and I think this may have been stated elsewhere, but the folks who are on the DRC today represent different departments. Will they still have a review before it goes to the Community Development Director?
Sure. So the DRC is composed of a staff member from planning, fire, engineering, and building. Those same individuals reviewing at the DRC level would also be reviewing at the building permit as well.
And then just for additional clarification for the commission before your discussion. So currently what happens is you submit a building permit for parking lot improvements, and that building permit is actually what goes to the DRC. So it's kind of an extra layer. You basically get comments that we would otherwise do during the building permit review process. Just the way the code's currently written, it requires it to go to DRC to give them those comments. So that is the proposal.
Okay, great, thank you. Questions? Okay. Then we'll close that portion. Discussion. Commissioner O'Donnell.
I don't have a problem with that, so if we're gonna do this, are you gonna do it item by item, or are we going to,
Yeah, we will have to, I think we have to repeat this for each item, but we can do it quickly, so.
okay, I would say I don't have a problem with the recommendation that is being made here.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay. I would just add a comment that this one does sound like streamlining, because, so, okay. Commissioner Badami.
And I believe there's no associated cost, so I'd be ready to make a motion. So I move to forward a recommendation of approval for Town Code Amended Application A-19-004, amendments to Chapter 29, zoning regulations of the Town Code regarding parking lot improvement regulations. I can make the required findings for CEQA and the required findings for the general plan.
Okay. And the second, Commissioner
second
Birch. Okay. And I just wanted to note before we vote that there were no public comments on this item. So all in favor? Opposed? 6-0. Okay, we move on to item number 4, Town Code Amendment A-19-006. And this is, again, town-wide, applicant Town of Los Gatos. And this is amendments to Chapter 29 regarding parking assessment district regulations. Ms. Schupman?
All right. This item in front of you is consideration for an amendment to Chapter 29 of the zoning code regarding parking assessment district regulations, as recommended by the Town Council Policy Committee and forwarded to you for your recommendation to the council. The recommendation from the Policy Committee proposes to remove the requirement for a variance application for the removal of on-site parking spaces that are accredited in the parking assessment district when the use is changed to a residential use that does not require the same amount of on-site parking spaces. This completes staff's presentation. We're happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions? Okay, none. Discussion? Oh, open and close public hearing? We have no comments, so we'll close public hearing. Comments? Commissioner O'Donnell?
If we're all ready, I think we could make a motion to approve it. And so I would make that motion that we make it the recommendation that the council approve the proposed changes, or proposed change, and that the necessary findings as set forth and attached would be a part of the motion. I will not state them because they are attached. So that would be the motion.
Okay. Second, Commissioner Badami?
Second.
Have a second. Further discussion? Okay, I'll call the question. All in favor? Okay, passes 6-0 unanimously. And there are no appeal rights, as this is a recommendation. Item number 5, Town Code Amendment, Application A-19-005, again, town-wide. Consider amendments to Chapter 29 regarding valet parking regulations. Ms. Schupman.
Lastly is a consideration of an amendment to Chapter 29 of the zoning code regarding valet parking regulations as recommended by the Council Policy Committee and forwarded to you for your recommendation to the Council. The recommendation from the Policy Committee proposes to remove the requirement that private parking lots outside of the parking assessment district may not charge for valet parking, and to modify the deciding body for valet parking permits from the Development Review Committee to the Director of Community Development. This completes staff's presentation.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Commissioner Janoff.
Just to clarify, the first bullet is a double negative, right? Okay. So we are now, the proposal is to allow those parking situations to charge for valet parking.
That's correct.
Okay, other questions? Okay, we have no cards from the public, so I will now close the public portion of the hearing, and we move to discussion or motion. Commissioner Badami.
I move to forward a recommendation of approval for Town Code Amendment Application A-19-005, amendments to Chapter 29, the zoning regulations of the Town Code regarding valet parking regulations. I can make the required findings for CEQA and the required findings for the general plan.
Thank you. Second, Commissioner Tavana.
Second.
I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Passes 6-0 unanimously, and there's no appeal rights on this either, I believe. The last item we have is item number 6, report from Director of Community Development. Mr. Paulson.
Great, thank you. Just briefly, at the August 6th Town Council meeting, the Town Council did the second reading, adopting the fence ordinance amendments to the town code for the hillside areas. So those will go into effect 30 days from that date. And the second item they heard was 16212 Los Gatos Boulevard. That was an item that the Planning Commission had forwarded a recommendation of denial for. Ultimately, they approved the project with modifications. After hearing from the applicant and looking at options for modifications, they allowed the number of parking spaces to be reduced so that the building could be pushed back to meet the 15-foot setback. And so ultimately that architecture and site application, or sorry, plan development application was approved. And lastly, I would just remind folks that tomorrow night we have a General Plan Advisory Committee meeting. So invite your friends and neighbors and come on down and spend the evening with us, a couple hours at least. And as we consider our 2040 General Plan update, which continues to discuss land use alternatives.
Thank you. The question on the Los Gatos Boulevard project, part of the, I know they moved the setback back, but did they change the configuration that had been proposed? In other words, is a lane of the boulevard still going to be removed in front of the project?
The same bike and ped improvements will be done that were reviewed by the Planning Commission, so no modifications were made to that.
Okay, thank you. Okay. In addition to serving on the Planning Commission, some commissioners are on other committees and commissions. Does anyone have anything to report from other committees tonight? Commissioner O'Donnell.
We had an earlier meeting, and I always forget the initials. Okay. We met today to consider a proposal for the present location of Los Gatos Lodge, which is roughly 8 acres. And the proponent is wanted comments on a proposal to add about 265 senior housing units. I think 44 of those would be for I would say dementia, which is the super category, otherwise referred to as Alzheimer's, but it's broader than that. So we discussed that, and it's, for example, the relationship to the high school behind it, relationship to the path, which some people would like us to be able to provide access for. The problem with the fact that something like this does not affect or does not credit us with the numbers for housing, the RHNA numbers that we otherwise need. And so that was identified as a problem. The applicant has another pretty much identical operation now under operation in Costa Mesa. And so those were the comments, and we'll see if they file their application, although I believe they will.
Thank you. And I believe General Plan didn't meet again, correct? So meeting tomorrow night, and then Historic Preservation, I don't believe, met since we last met. Okay, so with that, I want to thank everyone for participating in this meeting. On behalf of the Commission, this meeting is adjourned.